Where were the Cleveland Browns 10 years ago? That's right, it's time for the now annual 10-year look back at the Cleveland Browns. This is a video series we started last year. This year's video is coming a lot later than I would have liked. Usually this is kind of a preseason or early regular season video, but things got kind of hectic the last couple months and it just got very delayed, but better late than never, as they say. Anyway, without further ado, let's take a look back at the 2013 Cleveland Browns. All right, the 2013 Cleveland Browns. Now, before we get started, I want to start with a question for the audience to engage the audience a little bit. Where were you 10 years ago? Where were you 10 years ago? I had basically just graduated high school, and at this point, I guess in February 2014, I was midway through my freshman year at Ohio State. So, I know it's the cliche of all cliches, but it's mind-blowing to think that that was over a decade ago now. Anyway, the 2013 Cleveland Browns. So let's get started. Let's start by going over the regime that was in place, the power structure. The owner was Jimmy Haslam. This was his first full year as the owner. If you remember from last year's video, he bought the team midway through the season from Randy Lerner. The CEO was Joe Banner. Joe Banner was recommended by the NFL to Jimmy Haslam. Banner came from Philadelphia, where I believe he was like a salary cap person or something. General manager was Mike Lombardi. And that when Lombardi was brought in, that caused quite a stir because of his history with Cleveland. When Belichick was here, that's when Lombardi was here the first time, I think. I actually don't even know. I don't actually know the history. I don't know why he's so controversial in Cleveland. If somebody watching knows, please leave a comment. But he was brought in as the general manager, and that caused quite a stir. And the head coach was Rob Chudzinski. Head coach Rob Chudzinski. And by the way, all of these hires were brand new. So this was like starting in a new era for the Cleveland Browns because Haslam, cleaned house and brought in his own people. Brilliant decision, by the way. But anyway, the last name I mentioned was Rob Chudzinski. He was not the Browns' first choice. They went after a lot of big names, namely Chip Kelly. Chip Kelly was the head coach at Oregon, and the Browns seriously pursued him. But he kind of fleeced the Browns. I think he kind of led them on and used them for leverage, and then ended up taking the head coaching job in Philadelphia. So I forget the other big names, but the Browns went after a lot of names. Rob Chudzinski was kind of what they were left with. He was definitely not their first choice. So a very underwhelming hire, to say the least. But in Cleveland, we always, kind of like cling to like little points of optimism or little reasons to be optimistic. And people were pointing out that he was the offensive coordinator in 2007 when the Browns went 10-6. So that kind of had people like a little excited, I guess. Anyway, taking a look at his coaching staff, Rob Chudzinski's coaching staff, the offensive coordinator was Norv Turner. So big time hire there. That's a high profile name, former head coach. And the defensive coordinator was Ray Horton. So quick look at the coaching staff. Heading into the transactionary part of the offseason now, so free agency, draft, trades. Let's start with free agents. The biggest name the Browns picked up in free agency was Paul Kruger. They from the Super Bowl champion Ravens, the then Super Bowl champion Ravens. Linebacker, they signed him to a 5-year, $40 million deal. They also signed defensive tackle Desmond Bryant, quarterback Jason Campbell, quarterback Brian Hoyer. As you can see, they were really adding depth to the quarterback position. Take notes, Andrew Berry. Running back Dion Lewis. And Gary Barnidge, tight end, who wouldn't come to mean anything to Browns fans until a few years later, but it's worth pointing out that they picked him up in 2013. And obviously they signed other free agents, but these are just the ones worth mentioning. Taking a look at trades now, Devon Bess. The Browns traded for Devon Bess, wide receiver from the Dolphins. And they gave up a 4th and a 5th round pick in the 2013 draft. That was the biggest trade, obviously, from the offseason. Not much else to report. I know they also shipped Colt McCoy to San Francisco in some kind of trade. I don't have the specifics in front of me, but other than that, not much to report on the trade front. Taking a look at the draft now. Now, this was a very underwhelming draft. I mean, for whatever reason, the Browns were depleted with draft picks when it came to draft picks. So I'm just going to name all of them rather than the notable ones because there are so few. The first round pick was Barkevious Mingo out of LSU, who I believe was a linebacker. He might have been a defensive lineman. It could have been like a Cameron Wimbley situation. I don't know. He was the 6th overall pick in the first round. Then the Browns didn't have another pick until the 3rd round. And they took Leon McFadden, defensive back from San Diego State. Then in the 6th round, didn't have another pick till the 6th round. They took Jamorris Slaughter, defensive back from Notre Dame, the 6th round. Then in the 7th round, they had 2 picks. They took Armani Bryant, defensive end, East Central Oklahoma, and Garrett Gilkey, tackle from Chadron State. So, like I said, very underwhelming draft. Anyway, some storylines going into the season. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember any major storylines. Like in last year's video, the Browns got sold in the offseason, and that was a major storyline, obviously. I don't remember anything like that. I only remember generic stuff like, how will Brandon Weeden do in year 2? How will Trent Richardson do in year 2? Jimmy Haslam's first full year as the owner, blah, blah, blah. Just kind of generic stuff like that. Once again, if I'm wrong, somebody comment, but that's all I could think of. And that takes us to the regular season now. So we're fast forwarding to September. And this year's video is going to be a little different than last year. In last year's video, I didn't focus a lot on the regular season. I kind of glossed over it and was just speaking very generally, I feel like. So for this year's video, I'm going to go into a lot more detail about the specifics of the regular season. So here we go. The Browns started 0-2 with losses to Miami and Baltimore, 23-10 and 14-6 respectively. But a lot happened in those 2 weeks. First, the Browns shocked the league by making a blockbuster trade, sending Trent Richardson to Indianapolis for a first-round pick. And the reason I say that was a blockbuster trade, obviously we now know Trent Richardson is one of the biggest draft busts of all time, but at the time of this trade, nobody identified him as a bust, like not at all. That's why the Colts gave up a first-round pick. So everybody in Cleveland was furious about this trade, including myself. I remember an article picked up one of my tweets, actually. I wish I could find it. But people were furious about this because it kind of gave the impression that they were punting on the season. And then in week 2, Brandon Weeden suffered a hand injury at Baltimore. And that led most to believe that Jason Campbell would start because he was more experienced than Brian Hoyer. But the Browns surprised everyone and make Brian Hoyer, a virtually unknown backup at the time, the starting quarterback. In between the Trent Richardson trade and starting Brian Hoyer, I remember, again, distinctly thinking, they're clearly punting on the season. And I was really upset. But Brian Hoyer, though, he grabbed everybody's attention and made us eat crow because in his debut at Minnesota in week 3, he tossed 3 touchdowns and led the Browns to a surprise 31-27 win over the Vikings. And all 3 touchdowns were to Jordan Cameron, by the way. And we'll talk more about Jordan Cameron later on. But anyway, the Browns go on to win their next 2 games, improving to 3-2. But in their 3rd win, remember, it was a Thursday night at home against the Bills. Remember, Travis Benjamin had that punt return, that long punt return. Cleveland suffers a devastating blow when Brian Hoyer tore his ACL attempting to slide. Remember, he slid very awkwardly and ended up tearing his ACL, and it just sucked the wind out of the stadium, man. I mean, Brian Hoyer was I can't remember if I mentioned this already. He was the hometown hero. I believe he went to St. Ignatius. Or he went to one of those high schools. I don't know. I could be wrong. But local kid, hometown hero, led the Browns to 3 straight wins. And then, of course, tears his ACL in the most ridiculous way possible. Anyway, the Browns were forced to go back to Brandon Weeden. And this was kind of looked at as Brandon Weeden's last chance to be the franchise quarterback because the regime that drafted him, Tom Heckert and Mike Holmgren, were no longer around. So the current regime didn't have any reason to, support him, through thick and thin. So this was really his last chance. And Whedon did not take advantage of it. He went 0-2 the next 2 weeks. And he just looked awful, really, with losses to the Lions and the Packers. If you remember in that Lions game, that's when he had that ridiculous flip pass. And he actually, not many people know this, he did the same thing the next week at Green Bay, but it wasn't picked off. So I guess that's why nobody remembers it. But it's hard to do that once, let alone twice. Anyway, after those 2 pitiful games, Cleveland decides that they've seen enough, and they make the move to Jason Campbell. And Campbell breathes some life into the offense and the quarterback position. In his first start in Week 8 at Kansas City, the Browns lose 23-17, but he and the Browns play well. Campbell threw for 293 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks. Unfortunately, Travis Benjamin was lost for the season in this game. He suffered a torn ACL on a punt return, I believe. But still, the Browns played well. Campbell was such an upgrade to what we saw from Brandon Whedon. So there was kind of some reason for some optimism despite the loss. And the following week, the Browns delivered on that optimism. They got a huge win at home over the Ravens, 24-18, improving to 4-5. So a big win in the division. And if you can believe this snapped an 11-game losing streak to the Ravens at the time. That's just shocking. It's very hard to lose to one opponent 11 straight times. And Jason Campbell once again played great. He threw for 262 yards, 3 touchdowns, and no picks. So, things were looking good at this point at 4-5. And I know 4-5 might not seem like that big of a deal, but at this point in 2013 in Cleveland, 4-5 was a big deal. So just bear with us here if you're a viewer from another market. So the Browns hit the bye week. Oh, and I forgot to mention, after the trade of Trent Richardson, the Browns had a massive hole at running back. So they went out and signed Willis McGahee. Remember, former running back for the Bills and the Ravens. They signed Willis McGahee off his couch. So just like Flacco this year. And, he played like he had been on the couch. He didn't do much of anything with the Browns. In fact, running back, every year there's like a gaping hole in a roster, and then the following offseason you plug in that hole. And running back was definitely that weakness for the Browns in 2013. They had nothing there. So anyway, after the bye, the Browns have a huge game at Cincinnati. They basically needed to win to have any shot at the division title, because the Bengals, I think, were probably about 2 games ahead of them at that point, and they were kind of starting to pull away. Unfortunately, the Browns lay a massive egg and get humiliated 41-20. Jason Campbell came crashing back down to earth and became master of the check down. So obviously the Bengals figured him out. And what's funny about that game, though, is the Browns started that game red hot. Joe Hayden had a pick 6, and the Browns led 13-0 pretty early. But then the Bengals went on a 31-0 run, and it was over after that. Just a terribly disappointing game, and this is when everything really started to go off the rails for the 2013 Browns. Major spoiler alert, the Cleveland Browns do not win another game the rest of the way. In shocking fashion, they end the 2013 campaign on a 7-game losing streak to finish 4-12. Imagine being told that after they beat the Ravens. And that's why I say in the NFL, you truly have no idea what's on the horizon. You truly don't. Just to use a recent example, look at the Jaguars this year. They were 8-3, and then they finished 9-8. Imagine being told the Jaguars wouldn't make the playoffs when they were sitting at 8-3. And to use other examples with the Browns, fast forward to 2014 now. Remember Brian Hoyer? We went down to Atlanta, beat the Falcons. We were 7-4. Imagine being told at that point that not only will the Browns not win another game the rest of that season, they would only win 4 games the next 3 years combined. Imagine being told that when they were sitting at 7-4. You just would have been like, come again? So you just truly never know what's on the horizon in the NFL. Anyway, back to 2013 now. The following week, so after the disappointing loss to the Bengals in week 11, Browns host the Steelers in week 12. Very disappointing loss. Jason Campbell ends up getting injured. Just a dud of a game. Browns are forced to go back to Brandon Weeden as a result. By the way, in that Steelers game, Josh Gordon recorded over 200 yards receiving. So keep that in mind. Following week, Cleveland suffers a heartbreaking loss at home to the Jaguars at the very end. That was that game that Josh Gordon had that 95-yard touchdown in like the final minutes. But then the Browns defense blew it and gave up a game-winning touchdown at the very end. But even though they lost to fall to 4-8, Josh Gordon recorded his second consecutive 200-yard plus receiving game. So, and get this, at that point, I don't know if this still stands, but at that point, he was the only player in NFL history to have back-to-back 200-yard receiving games. So, round of applause for Josh Gordon. Anyway, and the final note on this Jaguars game, this was the game that the official Browns Twitter page trolled Brandon Weeden. You've probably seen that tweet. It's made the rounds on social media in recent years. Well, that was this game. It's funny how different social media was 10 years ago, because can you imagine the current Browns Twitter page like ragging on Deshaun Watson? I mean, that just would never happen. But anyway, following week, the Browns travel to New England and have just an heartbreaking loss, epic collapse, because the Browns played really well in this day. Jason Campbell balled out. Josh Gordon balled out. Had another really long touchdown, just like against Jacksonville. And Cleveland actually led by 12 with as little as a minute remaining. It was just like the Bears game in 2001. But then Patriots go right down the field, score a touchdown, get the onside kick. Thank you, Fozzie Whitaker. And then they get a bogus pass interference call that sets them up at the goal line. And they go in for the go-ahead score, and New England ends up winning. Heartbreaking game, 27-26. And you know what's funny? The Cleveland Browns have had so many brutal losses since 1999 that might not even crack the top three. I mean, just at the top of my head, the Jets game last year, Steelers game in the playoffs in 2002, Bears game in 2001. I mean, right there, that's three I can think of that are worse. Anyway, that loss to New England dropped the Browns to 4-9, and they were just circling the drain at this point. And as far as anything notable from the regular season, that was pretty much it. The Browns lost their last remaining games, their last three games, to the Bears, the Jets, and the Steelers, and they finished 4-12. So, however, in an amazing twist, the Browns decided to fire head coach Rob Chudzinski after just 1 year at the helm. Stunning, absolutely stunning. After the season finale in Pittsburgh, it was announced later that night that Chud would not be returning. Reports actually surfaced earlier that day before the game, but everybody just kind of scoffed at that, including me. I mean, because it just seemed unfathomable that they would fire Chud after 1 year, especially when he lost his quarterback, who was red hot in the beginning of the year, Brian Hoyer. So it just was shocking. Many second-guessed the decision, saying it was unfair to Chudzinski. And if you recall, a member of the Cleveland media essentially called Jimmy Haslam, Joe Banner, and Mike Lombardi the Three Stooges to their face. So it was wild. And, you know, I kind of alluded to this briefly. If Hoyer doesn't get injured, I mean, the Browns probably at least go 7-9, right? I mean, and that definitely would have given Chudzinski another year. So, I mean, that would have changed the trajectory of the Browns' history. And as a result, we probably don't know who Mike Pettin is. So it's interesting, you know, the domino effect and all that. And that was pretty much it for the 2013 Cleveland Browns. They were looking for a new head coach going into 2014, and that was that. Before we wrap things up, I want to review some other noteworthy things from the season, you know, other than just the results of the games and all that. You know, I want to talk about like accolades, stuff like that. Let's start with Josh Gordon. Josh Gordon had a remarkable Hall of Fame caliber season. He finished with over 1,600 receiving yards, and that was despite being suspended the first two games. So he did it in 14 games. And like I said earlier, he became the first player in NFL history to have back-to-back games with over 200 yards receiving. So once again, round of applause for Josh Gordon. Jordan Cameron, tight end out of USC. He had a breakout year this year. He recorded 80 catches, 917 yards, 7 touchdowns. And he was selected to his first Pro Bowl. And like I mentioned earlier, he had that 3-touchdown performance versus the Vikings in Week 3. And when I say that he had a breakout year, it really was a breakout year, because if you remember, when Jordan Cameron was drafted, he was kind of like a project pick out of USC. Tom Heckert, the Browns general manager at the time, recognized the athleticism there, because I think Jordan Cameron was a former basketball player at one point. So he was like a project draft pick. Like, hey, let's take a flyer on him. And it all came together in 2013. He had a Pro Bowl standout season. So Devon Bess, the big acquisition via trade from the Dolphins, he had a very disappointing year, to say the least. He finished with 42 grabs, just 362 yards, 2 touchdowns, and perhaps the most disappointing stat of them all, he only started 3 games the entire year. So very, very underwhelming. Paul Kruger, who signed that massive contract in the offseason from Baltimore, had a very disappointing year, and I'll just leave it at that. First-round pick Barkevious Mingo. He made some noise in his first career game, which was at Baltimore, but overall he didn't live up to the hype of being the 6th overall pick in the draft. He only started 3 games, so clearly they didn't get their return on the investment there. Brandon Weeden, we got the answer on whether or not he was the long-term answer. He was clearly not. He got benched twice. So it was clear the Browns were going to be moving on from Weeden. Checking in on the Trent Richardson trade, that turned out to be a steal for the Browns. Richardson ended up having no impact in Indianapolis, and people were giving Joe Banner high praise for that. I mean, he fleeced the Colts for somehow, some way getting a first-round pick for Trent Richardson. So a round of applause for Joe Banner here. But anyway, all that anger the Cleveland fans had at the time of the trade just turned out to be a waste of energy. It's not the only time it's happened. It's not the only time there's been a waste of energy in Cleveland. Moving on, the Browns would send 6 players to the Pro Bowl. So even though they finished 4-12, they still managed to send 6 players to the Pro Bowl. And that really kind of shows you how much the Pro Bowl had changed at that point. Because in the old day, let's say 2002 or something, if you finished 4-12, there was no chance you were sending 6 players to the Pro Bowl, unless you were the Cowboys or something, probably. But the Browns' Pro Bowlers were Josh Gordon, Jordan Cameron, Joe Thomas, Alex Mack, Joe Hayden, and TJ Ward. So that's a solid group of boys right there. Some notable players were playing their last season in Cleveland. Linebacker DeQuell Jackson, longtime team captain, was playing his last year in Cleveland. Safety TJ Ward, who I believe was a second-round pick in 2010, known for his big hits, he was playing his last year. And Greg Little, I mentioned him for ironic reasons. He was also playing his last year in Cleveland. So, and that was pretty much it. That was a look back at the 2013 Cleveland Browns season. Join me next year when we take a look at the 2014 Cleveland Browns. Anyway, guys, that's going to do it for the video. Once again, I apologize for the delay. This definitely should be more of a preseason or early regular season at the latest kind of video, but it just got kind of pushed back. What I will do to make up for that is I'll go ahead and announce what the next video is going to be. I usually only do that for my Patreon supporters, but I'll go ahead and announce that right here, right now. Next video is going to be the yearly season in review video. It usually comes around this time. I've been doing it every year since 2020. It's like that Chris Berman fastest 3 minutes format. So that will be the next video. And then after that, well, I guess you'll just have to subscribe on Patreon if you want to find out. But anyway, that's going to wrap things up. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe. Please follow me on Twitter, follow me on Twitch, and consider supporting me on Patreon. Until next time, I'm Ramen Robbie, and thanks for watching.